right, then we will move on to our discussion. George?
Well, in 12 years on town advisory boards, I think this is probably one of the, if not the most difficult issue that I think I've ever had to sit in on. I think what makes it so difficult is that it forces, or the citizens of Chapel Hill are forced to have to try to balance our desire and sense of responsibility to help and protect those less fortunate with our desire to protect our neighborhoods. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I don't think I can, in my mind, there probably isn't a single neighborhood in Chapel Hill that would welcome any shelter. My own neighborhood, when it was proposed to build East Chapel Hill High, opposed that because they were afraid of what the consequences would be. My own neighborhood, when Habitat proposed a neighborhood off of Sunrise, opposed that because they were afraid of the consequences. It's the fear of the unknown, I think, that forces all of us to sort of step back and say, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to see this because we don't know what it's going to bring. And so, and I'm not speaking in terms of the IFC's proposal, I'm speaking in terms of shelter guidelines. No matter what kind of a shelter is going to go into a neighborhood, most neighborhoods are going to fear that because they don't know what the future will bring. And so I think guidelines are critical to ensure, to minimize those fears. They'll never completely get rid of those fears. There's always the unknown. We can't predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen 5 years from now. We don't know what's going to happen a year from now. Somebody brought up the idea of what do you plan for expansion? Well, if we have needs for 100 homeless beds now, how do we know that we aren't going to need 500 5 years from now? We don't. But what we can do to minimize those fears is to try to provide as many protections as possible, and I think that's where guidelines come in. And I know the subcommittee has worked very hard at coming up with these recommendations, but my personal feeling is that they're not specific enough. We ran into this issue with our comprehensive plan that all of the principles of the comprehensive plan are viewed as good, but if you said, well, how do you actually put those into play? And it's very difficult without having more specifics, and that's why we've talked about revising comprehensive plan. I think if I were a organization that was building a shelter, I wouldn't quite know what the expectations would be based on what's here right now. And if I were a neighborhood, I equally wouldn't know what was going to happen. So I think my personal feeling is that we need to, and I don't know whether it's possible. I know the subcommittee has worked very hard. I don't know whether it's possible to get more specific guidelines, but in looking at the directive the council gave, it said a shelter policy with guidelines that the council would consider and include as stipulations. And in any of our special use permits, the stipulations are fairly specific. They really have some teeth to them. And I think I believe that we need to try to put some more teeth into these guidelines so that organizations that are going to be thinking of additional facilities, and unless things change dramatically on a national level and state level and county level, The responsibility for a lot of social programs is basically flowed downhill, and it stops at this level. We're responsible now for taking care of our citizens, and I think so. It wouldn't surprise me that there's going to be needs in the future for additional facilities, and so I think we need to try to make the guidelines as specific as possible for those. And not only for the organizations that are going to propose them, but for the neighborhoods where they're going to be sited, because they're going to go into some neighborhood. And as I said earlier, it's just natural reaction to anything coming into your neighborhood is I'd rather not see change, because you don't know what that's going to bring. So my feeling is I would like to spend some time, at least, I certainly am not prepared to move on this tonight. I would at least like to see another meeting, or maybe more, to work on these, to see if we can't come up with more specific guidelines that would, whether we can, again, my feeling is that people are always going to have concerns, but anything we can do to lessen those concerns, I think, will help.
Thanks, George. I think the spot that we found ourselves a lot was that there seemed to be a lot, I mean, there are a lot of regulations and ordinances all over the place, but every community is different. We didn't, what works in Cincinnati doesn't work in Chapel Hill. There's no specific definition of what constitutes overconcentration in places where they did deal with that issue. They were talking about for instance, three large homeless shelters within, a block or two. Nothing on the, way beyond the scale of what we are thinking here. So, is it appropriate for us to be considering that or not? As far as, that we have a fairly rigorous SUP process, for instance, that a lot of communities don't have. So those of us who are in Asheville know that a lot of things are approved like that by the planning board in Asheville, much larger projects than are here. They don't have the oversight of the council and the public process like we do. So we had a hard time committing ourselves to something that was very specific without some sort of objective reasoning behind it. It's not enough to say, I'm scared, I don't want it within 100 feet of X. That's not enough. There needs to be some hard evidence and some sort of background and information to show that that's the case. And sadly, there's been very little research on a lot of this. I spoke with the person who did the crime report for the downtown that most of us saw earlier in the process. And at least according to her, she said her report and another report that she had done were about the only ones that had really looked at the impact, the crime impact of homeless shelters in neighborhoods, and that there was very little in the way of statistics to show. In fact, what statistics there were seemed to show that I printed out what statistics there were. I'm quoting from her email response to me that overall researchers have found that homeless individuals commit crimes based on need, like stealing food or breaking into an abandoned building for shelter, etc. They are more often charged with these types of crimes than other types of crimes, such as violent person crimes. Homeless individuals have a much lower arrest rate than domiciled persons for violent and property-related crimes. However, homeless people are more often victims of crime than a domiciled person. That doesn't square with the perception that most people have. And so which one do you choose to base your guideline on, your standard? And so that's the dilemma that we found ourselves in for most of the things we considered. I'll relinquish the floor in a second, but one of the things that I thought was most promising and that would lend itself to be introduction as a stipulation is the Good Neighbor Plan, a clear and detailed plan stating how impacts on neighborhoods would be addressed and mitigated, and setting up some sort of mechanism for regular neighbor feedback. And I think one of the speakers made that same suggestion, that that's a mechanism that can be written in as a stipulation and would provide a mechanism for the neighbors to have, perhaps regularly scheduled annual, semi-annual meetings for input from the neighbors. And there's a way to mitigate if it's not being met. Then some penalties can. It could be stipulated in such a way that there's a penalty for not mitigating particular situations. A lot of the other things that we looked at are already they're already required in the stipulations. The lighting plans, the other safety and monitoring issues. They're included as part of the general design guidelines now. So when we got to those and began asking about them, we discovered they're already requested and required for these types of applications. So we were looking for things that could specifically apply to this. But that's one that I would put my finger on, that certainly would be a stipulation. I realize the others are a little squishy, but that was kind of the position we found ourselves in. Yes. Well,
one of the things I think obviously the committee worked hard to look for examples, and as you mentioned, it's hard to find appropriate examples. But maybe that's because there's no place like Chapel Hill. Maybe we have to sort of lead, not follow. We have to come up with things that we just say make sense for this community, whether it's been done elsewhere or not. I don't know. It's always good to look and say what other people have done, but I look at Gilroy, and other than being about the size of Chapel Hill, I'm not sure what it has in common. I presume it doesn't have a university. It may have. I don't think I've ever heard of Garlic University, but having visited Gilroy during the Garlic Festival, that seems to be their main thing. But I don't know that there's any place quite like. Well, certainly we have towns like Ann Arbor and Madison that have been some examples, but we're somewhat unique. Large university, a large amount of non-taxable property in town, the issues that in some ways make things more difficult, but perhaps can make things a little easier too. We have a university perhaps we can tap into for some of the things we need, but again, I know you've worked very hard on this, but I just feel right now that it needs to have more teeth in it before we send it to council, because otherwise I think council's going to be faced with the same dilemma. How do you put enough teeth into it that when any application comes in, that people are going to feel fairly confident that there's some way to ensure that their needs are being met, not only the needs of the applicant, but the needs of the community at large. And we might spend, another meeting, and we might spend another 5 meetings in that. We obviously have to put a time frame out. We have to say, what can we do? We've heard from the citizens. They've given some suggestions, and I don't know whether over the next couple of meetings we can come up with some additional things that would strengthen this or not. But certainly I think this is such an important issue